with you relevant links and articles and reports that accompany our panelists' interventions. It's great to see so many of you attending. I'm sorry we're not in Vienna, that we're beaming from our front rooms and our kitchens, but it's great to have you all together for this important webinar session. So a very, very warm welcome to this webinar, Legal Regulation of Drugs Through a Development Lens, part of the 64th session on the Commission of Narcotic Drugs. I'm just going to do a little bit of housekeeping. So this webinar is recorded. I'll be able to send you a recording of this afterwards. Please use the chat box throughout the session to engage with each other and also to be able to download some of the links we share with you. Make sure that you're using panelists and attendees so that everyone can see. And finally, at the end of the session, we will be having a Q&A where you can pose questions. So please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screens to pose questions. Great. It's brilliant to see friends and colleagues from around the world coming in. That's brilliant. Okay, so I'm delighted to introduce to you our panel today. All amazing advocates, personally responsible for designing and furthering legal regulation to support human rights, public health, and social justice around the world. We have Zara Snapp, co-founder of Instituto, Mexico. We have Philasande Mahlakata, project coordinator from Umzimvubu Farmers Network, South Africa. Lorenzo, lead drafter of the Cocaine Regulation Bill from Colombia. Juan Fernandez, Ochoa, campaigns and communication officer from International Drug Policy Consortium. And myself, I am Clemmie, a campaigner at Health Poverty Action. So it's clear, IDPC also had a press release this morning, which we will be posting in the link, that prohibitionist drug policy has failed to reduce the scale of the drugs market, let alone achieve a drug-free world. It's undermined efforts to tackle poverty, improve access to health, reduce violence, and defend human rights of the most marginalized communities around the world. With only 9 years left to reach the Sustainable Development Goals, there is enormous scope for achieving these goals by advancing socially just models to legally regulate drugs. The exciting news is this is happening and is being explored and implemented globally in many different guises and at different ministerial levels. In the last month, we have seen progressive reforms in the USA, in New Mexico and New York, and today we'll be hearing from our colleagues in Mexico, South Africa, and Colombia. I think we're all becoming used to the phrase, it's less about when we will legally regulate and more about how we will transition to legal regulation. Replacing prohibition with a bold, strong legal regulatory framework designed with social justice, human rights, and public health at its centre is an achievable political goal. Legal regulation can strengthen sustainable development within the drugs trade. At Health Poverty Action, however, we believe this impact will extend much further. We believe that the policy of prohibition is one of the primary factors causing poverty and preventing sustainable development across a country as a whole. Changing this will fundamentally improve some of the most important drivers of poverty eradication and development, including addressing armed conflict, weak and under-resourced state services, state fragility, corruption, gender justice, and institutional racism, all of which are currently severely impacted by drug policy. Legal regulation through a development lens will enable positive coherence and mutual reinforcement between drug policy and development that prohibition has made impossible. Many harms caused by prohibition would end by decriminalisation. Other harms, however, will only be addressed through the introduction of legal frameworks that have been designed with the involvement of the very people whose rights and social development have been adversely affected by prohibition. To contribute towards achieving the SDGs, legal regulatory frameworks must be considered for the whole supply chain, from cultivation, production, trade, possession, and use. It is important that regulations are culturally appropriate and incorporate particular recognition for traditional uses. With the support of our international partners and recommendations from our webinar series, A World with Drugs, that we organised last year, we would like to propose a lens inspired by the SDG icon through which to view drug policy reforms. We've identified 15 key areas considered to be areas of consideration to be included in legal regulation policy. If these considerations are prioritised as objectives and goals for legal regulation, it will have a direct impact on strengthening sustainable development, including at least 11 of the 17 SDGs. These 15 areas are, hopefully you can see them, we're posting this in the chat as well, so you can download this document because I appreciate it's quite small. But these areas are sustainable livelihoods, community participation, cultural, traditional and indigenous rights, labour rights, a just transition, public health, environmental protection, racial justice, gender justice, restorative justice, tax justice, trade justice, managing corporate power, peace and reconciliation, and good governance and services. This lens also serves as a guide to highlight the intersections where there is a need for collaboration, contribution, and commitment to drug policy from the development sector and broader social justice movements working in these areas. We'd like to invite our colleagues who recognise themselves in this lens and their work to come and include drug policy into their agenda. In order to ensure legal regulation reduces poverty, promotes healthy lives and human rights, particular consideration has to be given to regulating corporations. In countries where legal markets are created mainly for export, small producers are frequently currently barred from accessing legal trade due to technical, legal and financial barriers. Without specific policies to address this, the likelihood is that large corporate investors, most likely from the global north, will monopolise the market, maximising their profits through extractivist models that harm local communities and the environment that they live in. Many current trades, such as coffee, cotton, tobacco, minerals, medicine, are by no means blueprint to replicate. Historical colonial legacies, which are rooted in these trades, permit corporations to operate using similar practices of unchecked extraction and exploitation. To highlight the risk of problematic regulation, we've designed an alternative lens. This second lens is a snapshot of a future scenario that showcases the likely risks that will get played out if legal regulation is given a green light, but excludes any one of these development objectives. You can see that the future is not bright and possibly very familiar. Those who have been most at risk of poverty and exploitation during prohibition will still be at risk in a post-prohibition world if multinational corporations dominate. We have an opportunity to mitigate this domination and a responsibility in 2021 to move quickly, for the opening for responsible legal regulation is now. Today we'll be hearing from colleagues who are at the frontier of this progressive change. I will now hand over to Zara, Zara Snapp from Instituto. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Clemmie. Well, I think you give us an excellent view of what we would like and then what we're afraid of what might happen. And really, I would suggest if anyone's really interested in this to go look at the webinar series that we did in the in the fall of last year, because it really did, well, the fall if you're living in this hemisphere, it really did dig deep into many of these issues. Yeah, so as Clemmie said, I'm the co-founder of Instituto. We're a Mexican nonprofit that works on advocacy and research on drug policy. We've been closely following the legislative process of cannabis regulation in Mexico, and I'm happy to take any questions about that more specifically at the end of this. And I'm just pleased to be here with my colleagues as part of the CND. So as we heard from Clemmie, under Prohibition, really what we see and what we feel and what we experience and what we're living in many of our countries is that war and conflict and violence and criminalization is acceptable. We see this huge integration between the state and non-state actors and corruption that tends to take over institutions. Countries often, and Lorenzo is here who can speak from the Colombian experience, but receive international aid to fight drug trafficking, which is then used to buy arms, equipment, and to increase capacity. And this primarily has been from the United States, at least in Mexico and in other Latin American countries. We've also focused on a kingpin strategy, which takes down the top people. But really, when you take down the top people, you don't necessarily, you see a fracturing of groups, which can create greater disorganization, greater violence. And for example, in Mexico, we used to have 8 or 9 groups that were kind of controlling the market, and now we have 80 to 90 who have diversified into many other activities. And so really this spurs this poverty also that Clemmie mentioned, that really can continue to make it easy for groups to operate under these conditions. When there aren't good opportunities for young people, joining an organized criminal group can often be one of the better economic choices that you're making in your life. And really what we're here to talk about as development is that cultivating communities are stuck. They get paid low prices by organized criminal groups for their product. They take risks to find better prices, or they have their crops eradicated oftentimes by the military. And so this is where then you don't really have a choice between cultivating or not, and often you're not the owner of your work. And so really with legal regulation, what we're trying to do is to shift dynamics that are currently underway. There has been little to no reduction in production or consumption. And one of the things that we talked about a lot in the webinar series was that a world with drugs is a reality, and drug policy reform can contribute to peace building if it's done intentionally and with purpose. Next, please. So then when we think about how do we begin to, I have my slides here. So how do we really, with regulation, try to change some of these structural conditions? And really what we are doing here in Mexico is how do we change the actions of the state? That's the actor that we believe that we have greater influence over. One of the big questions folks ask is, but how will the narcos, how will the cartels respond? We don't use some of that language, and really the answer is it's not up to us to change non-state actors. It's up to us to change the conditions around the state and then create regulations where you are then building in the possibility for non-state actors to transition from an illegal market to a legal market. And so it's no longer what we seek to change with a law is that the state will no longer arrive to persecute individuals for their own consumption or for carrying small quantities, nor will they show up to communities to eradicate crops, but rather you show up to a community to say, what do you need to ask for a license? What do you need to comply with the requirements that are being set out under legal regulations? It's called creating a level playing field for all. But what we're looking for is not necessarily a level playing field, but one that privileges and creates benefits and incentives to communities that are currently cultivating and that require greater accompaniment. And so that's where the state also has a great responsibility to create the conditions and incentives to shift these actors from an illegal to a legal market. And when you begin to do that, then you can begin to strengthen the rule of law. You can begin to strengthen the capacity of communities to advocate for their own needs and their own to organize across in a horizontal way. We have really had a vision of what this market could look like in Mexico, so that it is not a hierarchical with 4 or 5 large companies taking over the market, but rather how do you create a horizontal market with many actors? And obviously the state has the capacity to determine taxes, both as income and how to spend them. What are going to be our priorities? Next, please. So when we think about development, it's really about development for whom, because there's plenty of folks who would be happy to take some of these incentives. And so what we really have tried to do, and I think all of us have these lenses or these frameworks that we're working within, we've developed from RIA this social justice framework, and that composes of 4 principles. And then of course we can dive deep into any of the lens that Clemmie shared, or that Juan will share at the end. But really it's about how do we actively confront dynamics of privilege and oppression. And so how do we recognize who are the groups that we are trying to build into a legal and a social justice framework? And for us, that's people who use cannabis, who've been criminalized, and people who communities that cultivate cannabis and that have been actively oppressed. So it's not about bringing in new actors, it's about actively recognizing those who have already been part of it. And so when we recognize the existence of these groups, then we can confront these dynamics of privilege and oppression that we are already living and that are quite deeply ingrained in most of our societies. So the fact that I can talk about these issues and I talk about them openly, and I talk about legal regulation, is in large part because I am a woman who's white, who has enough privilege to be able to talk about these issues. And if I was a young person who is from a smaller community, or who doesn't have the tools to be able to do it, I might not be able to. And so how do we create conditions so that anyone can speak about these issues and speak about them safely? The third principle is how do we generate affirmative and retributive actions to balance the level of justice and power? So it's not just about that level playing field. It's about how do we create benefits? How do we create really affirmative and social justice measures? And finally, how do we designate resources towards reparation? So we do believe that we need to repair the harms of prohibition. It is not just enough to speak about it. We need to really think about how do we create funds. And I also think it's important to recognize that, you don't always get this on your first try. You don't always get the perfect law. And I know we have some folks who are from Colorado, like they are going back now to create social justice means of and a fund to kind of help bring these actors and social equity into the equation. And this is something that didn't happen in 2012. And so they're going back to figure it out. So now to speak just very briefly on what's going on in Mexico, the next slide, please. We have been in a very long process of more than 3 years of debate, of legislative debate. And this comes because of the jurisprudence, which was declared in 2018 from the Supreme Court, where then they send a mandate and they say, you have a certain amount of time. They've been given 3 extensions on that time. Now they're threatening to ask for another extension because the final deadline was April 30th, 2021. And so now the Senate is threatening to ask for another one. We're hoping that doesn't happen, because we do feel like we need to advance. It's not just about the discussion. So the law contemplates 3 access routes. It contemplates cultivation for personal use between 6 and 8 plants. It talks about cannabis associations with up to 20 members, which is obviously not a lot, but it's a step in the right direction. And these are without commercialization. So this is so this is an alternative to the commercial market. And then there's the regulated market, which is really where that development piece has to be integrated. And so this would be overseen by the National Commission on Drug Addiction. The previous version was going to have an institute that was created, and they used to have a quota, a percentage of licenses that were going to go to communities that had been specified in the law. Those communities continue to be specified, but so we are recognizing the existence of groups that have been historically marginalized in this bill. But the language has changed to now be preference and priority will be given to these communities during those 3 years. But what does preference and priority mean? That is obviously our biggest concern. How do we ensure that that is we are able to evaluate and measure that over time? And obviously, once the bill is passed and we move into this implementation model, we will be looking at how do we ensure that that the first licenses, for example, go to these communities and that this preference is really shown on paper as well. And then there is accompaniment that is provided in the law to communities and small businesses. And this is where we then begin to think about how do we build in that horizontal market? How do we make this? And for those of you who maybe have come to Mexico or seen, we don't want this to be the tequila industry where there is 1 to 2 large companies. We want it to be the mezcal industry where there are many cultivators, where there are many folks who are engaged in this work and who are then the owners of their work and who can have greater access to these possibilities and a greater repartición, a greater division of the gains that are made in this market. Obviously, civil society will be key, and we continue to accompany this process. But it's really important to know that if you don't begin the journey, you'll never arrive. And this is something that, for us from civil society, we've had to negotiate what we are okay with and what we're not okay with. But we also believe that we wouldn't be at this point if it wasn't for civil society, because it was civil society that pushed the jurisprudence in the Supreme Court. And so we need to take every step we can to move forward and to be able to see how we dismantle the system one piece at a time. We know it's hard, and therefore we have to be bold, but we do believe that if you do this intentionally, we can have a greater social impact. It's not we will not solve all of Mexico's issues with regulating cannabis, but it will be one of many interventions that are necessary in order for us to move forward and to create greater development opportunities for rural communities and to be able to repair the harms of prohibition. Thank you. And I'm going to hand it over to Philasande, who's the next speaker. Thank you. I know we have to be even when we're at the CND, you always have to be so quick and just, so there you go, Philasande.
Thank you so much, Zara and Clemmie, and for elaborating that ever so well. It speaks so much on behalf of everything else that I know also down here in South Africa. There is so much that we have in common in terms of how the rural communities have been treated in the past. I am Philasande Mahlakata, project coordinating for a small organization called Umzimvubu, Farmer Support Network. We have come a long way as an organization since the times when we first started out. We were advocating against the aerial spraying and eradication of cannabis fields, which also included areas where people were growing their own food and going into waterways and just basically contaminating everything, and including the grazing spaces for animals. We have seen a lot of change since then, since we started out in 2015. In 2018, we first experienced, for the first time, conversations whereby government was willing to now start conversations with regards to creating an industry for cannabis farmers. And of course, much as it was a very good step to take to say that South Africans are now allowed to cultivate and to use cannabis privately in their private space, but without actually saying how much they were allowed to use at a time or allowed to cultivate. And then further giving one government department the responsibility to then form the policy and the law that would guide how it is all done, how we cultivate, how we use, how we traffic, and so forth. So cannabis-related policy in South Africa is formed by the government agency that is the Department of Justice and Correctional Services. This is the same ministry that is responsible for and deals with various types of crimes such as murder, corruption, and so forth. So many have expressed their concerns as to why it is this particular department that is tasked to form cannabis policies rather than having the Department of Agriculture, for instance, being the one that is responsible for this, as cannabis is a land issue, agricultural issue, more than it is a criminal issue, but we have a long way to go in between. However, it goes without saying that many other government agencies remain an integral part of forming and shaping a cannabis policy that will ultimately guide the budding industry. We also have agencies and portfolio committees such as the Department of Housing and Human Settlements, the Departments of Transport, who would, for instance, prescribe the permitted amounts for people to travel with. And we also have the Departments of Social Development, Department of Health, and many others. And for a long time, cannabis-related matters were sitting with the Department of Health, but that is slowly changing. We also feel that there is a crucial need for educating people of the bigger scope of the cannabis industry, aside just from recreational use. And others may like to refer to it as responsible adult use, and rightfully so. And this has also played a major role in fueling the thriving underground market that is the recreational market, really. That's the greater part of the existing cannabis industry in our country. That's all we have known to use it for, either for recreational use and for medicinal use. So we are playing about in that space of now seeing how far we can go with it. It also remains important to emphasize on the effects of using cannabis, especially for the youth, as it has taken over 100 years to stigmatize marijuana in South Africa. So we feel that there should be a considerably fair amount of effort applied to undoing this century-old stigma, and the Department of Education is perhaps the appropriate agency that should be tasked with such a responsibility, along with the rest of the other portfolio committees that form government that now wants to create an industry that is inclusive of the previously marginalized communities and so forth. So cannabis and hemp-related matters, such as the acquisition of cultivating licenses and permits, have been in the past a responsibility for the Department of Health, as I mentioned earlier. However, as of recently, hemp is at its transitioning stage to being declared an agricultural crop, and marijuana remains under the strict prohibitions, still sitting with the Department of Health. So many have concerns, expressed their concerns on the definition between hemp and marijuana, and why the differences between the two are so drastic as to even place them under two different departments when they essentially belong to one genus. So there is a lot of engagement that needs to happen between all of the things that are concerned with cultivating between the government departments that are responsible, as well as the cultivating communities. Marijuana in our country, as is with the rest of the world, has a centuries-long history as a medicinal plant, along with hundreds of other plants that have been used in the same manner. The plant falls within many whose indigenous knowledge has been passed down from generation to generation. So this includes a wide range of psychedelic or mind-altering plants whose effects have been recorded and used with much caution in healing methods throughout history. So we have a large scope of traditional healing within the country versus the Western type of healing and medicinal practices and so forth. And with all of these, people have acquired incredible knowledge of how to use the plants, in what measurements, in what conditions, and we have diverse means of healing people, not just for ailments, illnesses, but on a spiritual level as well, and religious level as well. So there is a lot of times one feels that the current regulations continue to undermine the indigenous knowledge of rural communities and their healers across the globe, because they are just in no way being given the chance to express what it is that they know, and given the chance to use cannabis as they see fit. So one has to ask, is it not the time for these marginalized communities to be considered when these regulations are being drafted? And how is it that time and again, policy that affects these communities is formed, and those affected by it the most are not even properly consulted? The indigenous knowledge systems are the backbone of every community everywhere in the world. A lot of information has been sourced from them for centuries. A lot of medicinal knowledge has been extracted from them, and therefore it is only fair to trust that they know what they are doing. As it stands, there are no recorded fatalities related to using marijuana in South Africa, at least, and compared to that of using alcohol, nicotine, and other sort of hard drugs, so to speak. There's plenty of room for the law enforcers and those who they consider to be the lawbreakers to work the space of legal regulation in synergy. The legal regulation in the country right now allows us to cultivate for private purpose in one's privacy. It does not take into account those who cultivate for commercial purposes. So the question is, if it is good enough for me to use in my privacy, why then can I not commercialize? Why can communities not commercialize? Why is this being closed off to them and only very limited to their personal use? Because then surely there's got to be something in the use of marijuana that is acceptable in society somehow. The majority of subsistence farmers in South Africa grow marijuana as a means to sustain their livelihoods rather than for own consumption. And of course, people use it in many different ways. They use it to medicate at home for minor ailments, chest ailments. They use it as a tea. They use it for various things, really. In August 20.
Philasande, we've just got 1 minute. Sorry, thank you.
In August 2020, a cannabis for private purpose bill started circulating on the social media. And again, this just goes to give us the scope that the people that are responsible for reaching out to these communities don't really have a way of connecting with these communities, these marginalized communities, because a 23-page legal document is just no way going to make its way on IT platforms to these communities that don't have power, that are not educated in the sense of being able to read and so forth. So the contents of the bill prescribing that we can only ever grow 4 plants per person and 8 plants per household is just seemingly very unfair and unthought of. But we welcome the vote by the Commission for Narcotic Drugs to remove cannabis for medicinal use from the category, classifying it among some of the world's most dangerous drugs. That hasn't gone unnoticed. We believe it is a great step for the future of cannabis in South Africa, and our role as UFSN is to continue reaching out to those who matter the most in this situation, being the people who make the laws globally, as well as the farmers. So we are here to say that how can we help each other meet each other halfway somewhat. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Philasande. And now, Lorenzo, over to
Thank you
you.
very much, Clemmie, and everyone for this invitation. I'm very happy to be here with you. So I will use my time to tell you about our experience with a bill to regulate the coca and cocaine market in Colombia. So I will tell you first why we did this, which is like very close to what Zara mentioned for the case of Mexico. Then go through the details of the bill and show you how regulating the coca and cocaine market in Colombia would actually contribute to the development goals. So next, please. So as Zara mentioned in her intervention, when the policy has failed over and over again, I think the natural thing to do is to reconsider that policy. That's exactly what has happened with the war on drugs in Colombia. Actually, it has not only failed, but it has also like caused immense suffering to Colombians, and it has hindered like human rights and development in the country. So here I've mentioned a few of the evidence that shows that. So it has failed because the production of cocaine in Colombia has not decreased despite all the efforts to reduce the supply. It has actually like increased by 120% between 2008 and 2018. But also not only has it failed, but it has also caused a lot of suffering. So to give you some examples, it's estimated that around 3,800 people die each year in Colombia because of the war on drugs. It has cost a lot. Basically, in the past 10 years, between 2005 and 2014, the government spent the equivalent of the budget of the agricultural ministry for 50 years. It has also had a huge negative impact on the environment, causing 24% of deforestation in 2017. It's a major source of overcrowding, of human rights violations, where like on average 9 people in Colombia are arrested for drug-related crimes every hour. And as you can imagine, it's fueled corruption and political instability. So I think these are like enough reasons to consider a different approach. And this is what we try to do with this proposal. Next, please, which was presented last year in June by a group of 20 congressmen. And so the idea is to regulate all stages of the coca and cocaine market. So from the cultivation of the coca until the retail and consumption of cocaine, but also any other product that is derived from the coca leaf. So starting with cultivation, the idea is that coca plantations will be authorized, but only in the areas where coca is currently being grown, and as long as they remain outside of the environmentally protected areas. The reason to do that is twofold. First, the idea, as Zara was mentioning, is that we believe that the war on drugs has been like extremely unfair towards marginalized communities. And so by regulating the market and making sure that they are the ones who benefit from this, we will be like trying to repair, and it will be like a reparatory measure based on the harm that the war on drugs has inflicted on them. That's the first reason. The second reason to limit the market to local producers is to ensure that they actually benefit local growers, is that they actually benefit from this new legal market and prevent the arrival of big actors who will probably take over the market. So we want to make sure that if we legalize the market, they are the main beneficiaries. Also, we will try to encourage the creation of cooperatives, of local farmer cooperatives, to ensure that they have like all the means to increase their production. So this is about coca cultivation. Now, what about the production of cocaine? So in this case, what we have in mind is a system where the state would buy the harvest required to meet the demand of the legal cocaine market, both nationally and internationally. Of course, like it will have to be with the agreement of other countries. And then the state will subcontract the transformation of the coca leaf into cocaine through research centers and laboratories. As for all the other aspects of coca-based products that are not cocaine, this will be left to the market, as I'm going to mention right now. So about the retail and consumption, so the third phase of this regulation, the idea is that we will regulate depending on the harm to health that the products cause. So the first set of regulations, which would cover like low potency products, such as the coca leaf itself, for example, like beverages, food, and cosmetic products, In this case, we will have like a very light regulation, similar to the one already in place, for example, for coffee. And in this case, private actors, as I just mentioned, will be able to like sell and produce these products freely. The second type of regulation will be much more stricter, and it will cover products like cocaine, so like who have like an effect on health. And in this case, what we have in mind is that consumers will have to go through a medical checkup and register in a database before being allowed to buy a certain dose of cocaine in registered pharmacies. And of course, like all sort of like limitations to advertisement and sponsoring will be in place. The third type of regulation, and this is the strictest one, would cover products such as crack cocaine, which due to their health consequences will remain prohibited, but they would not be criminalized, and a harm reduction strategy will be adopted to ensure that all problematic consumers can actually receive adequate social and medical treatment. Next, please. So thanks to this regulation, we believe that we will be contributing to at least 4 social, sustainable development goals. So we think that we are going to contribute to reduce poverty. First, because as I mentioned, we will be restricting this market to coca farmers and cooperatives. This will also give the opportunity for the state to provide technical assistance to these communities, which is forbidden right now. And it will also ensure secure land property rights. This regulation, we believe, will also contribute to improve health, in this case, health of consumers, through better quality products, through better information about these products, and also through a harm reduction strategy. We believe this regulation will also contribute to SDG number 15, which is life on land, through a reduction of deforestation, and also by reducing the contamination of water sources that are actually caused today when coca leaves are transformed into cocaine. And last and probably most importantly, we believe this project will contribute to peace and justice by decreasing violence, by reducing the incentives to engage in corruption, and by redirecting government spending into like more social projects. Next, please. So of course, this is not going to solve all problems, and we are very well aware of that. But as Zara mentioned, we have to start from somewhere. We think Colombia is a very good place to start. And so I look forward to all your questions. Thank you very much. And I will hand it over to Juan.
Thank you so much, Lorenzo. Before I start, I just wanted to spare a thought for our colleagues in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. The community, the growing communities of the island have been a leading light in conversations about legal regulation of cannabis, and I know they're under stress because of the volcano eruptions in the island, so just thinking about them. I wanted to thank my co-panelists for their insightful presentations, and of course Health Poverty Action, not only for creating this space, but also for constantly inviting us and others to think of this issue through the prism of development. As my colleagues have said, there's a clear sense of both momentum and urgency for this conversation to take place. There's now some 50 countries that have adopted regulatory frameworks for medical cannabis. And as the presentations today make clear, debates and policy developments on the legal regulation of substances for non-medical and adult use are maturing across the globe. Ensuring that the transition from informal markets to legally regulated ones take place in a way that contributes to repairing the harm of punitive drug policies and respond to the needs of our communities must be at the heart of the debate. So for that reason, legal frameworks need to be designed to advance social justice, inclusion, and human rights rather than buttressing private or corporate interests. And it is with this goal in mind that in September of 2020, IDPC published Principles for the Responsible Legal Regulation of Cannabis. In a way, it's an overdue publication. For years, as the secretariat of a global network of 191 organizations, we were a bit concerned about the potential backlash that taking this stance would have on colleagues who live in places where people who use drugs are routinely brutalized and dehumanized. And we're advocating for even the most basic rights can come at great personal cost. But it's also our members that have led these debates at local, national, international level, wherever they're taking place. And based on their initiative, on their expertise and vision, these principles emerged after 2 years of incredibly rich and useful consultations. The principles focus on cannabis is not arbitrary. Today's commemoration of the 60th anniversary of the Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs reminds us that the treaty system placed cannabis in the most restrictive of schedules. And it was only in December of last year that the CND finally took cannabis out of Schedule 4 of the 1961 Convention, even if it left it in Schedule 1. And I think that situation, as my colleagues have already reminded us, reflects the convention's drafters turning their back on centuries of cultural, ceremonial, medicinal, and religious uses, which reflected harmful colonial and racist attitudes that are still embedded in drug control today. Cannabis is also the most widely used and produced controlled drug in the world, which speaks volumes, as Lorenzo just said, not only the failure of prohibitionist approaches in their own terms, but the need to develop sustainable alternatives that can respond to both the challenges and opportunities of use and cultivation. And finally, and colleagues have also said it very well, cannabis policies have had a huge negative impact on the health and welfare of our communities, and in particular on people who are already pushed into situations of vulnerability because of poverty, because of racism, because of patriarchal violence, and other forms of structural oppression. So having that in mind, the current momentum for legal regulation of cannabis creates a window of opportunity of sorts to move towards reparatory and rights-affirming policies that progress social justice. And it's in advancing this vision that the 20 principles come about under 6 headings. First, that legal markets should protect the health and human rights of people who use drugs, providing them with comprehensive access to health services and with a full range of rights and protections that any proficient, regulated and legal market affords. Secondly, that legal markets should advance social justice by seeking to repair the harms of punitive drug policies, including by ensuring that communities most affected by prohibition can transit to the legal market if they so desire. Third, that regulatory frameworks should promote business models and international trade policies that advance inclusion, sustainable development, and climate justice at all levels of supply chains. Fourth, that legal reform should remove punishments and criminalization for drug use and ancillary activities. And this is just not for cannabis, but for all drugs. Legal regulation is an opportunity also to decriminalize people who use drugs. And for supply-related activities, where retained for other substances and for all substances, sanctions should be strictly proportionate and favor non-custodial interventions. Legal regulations also must adopt a gender-sensitive approach to redress the disproportionate and specific harms that women have experienced under prohibition. And finally, these new regulatory frameworks must include mechanisms for collecting, analyzing, and disseminating comprehensive data on drug markets and use, and this including by civil society and affected communities. The way we understand a legal regulation is as an iterative process that needs to be agile in responding to market evolutions and also lessons learned. So I wish we could go deeper into these 6 headings, but I don't want to run out of time. So I just want to conclude on the fact that while these principles in this publication were thought in relation to cannabis, this doesn't mean that cannabis should be treated exceptionally. And I'm really glad that Lorenzo was here talking about coca and coca derivatives. The principles and underlying values of social justice, equity, and human rights should be at the heart of any form of regulation. So in the coming years as a network, we'll continue to learn and to listen from regulatory experiences worldwide, but also from academic research and of course from community knowledge and expertise to build on and strengthen these principles. So that's it for me, and back to Clemmie.
I'm just on mute. Thank you, everybody. I feel like we have presented a menu of frameworks today, and really brilliant way to kick off the CND. And I'm hoping that you will all stay in touch. My email is cjames@healthpovertyaction.org. I am very happy to send any of the links that we've shared today. All of the frameworks, we can send links to you. Thank you very, very much to all of our panelists for absolutely fascinating interventions and contributions, and for all the work that's behind the scenes to create these frameworks. We are really lucky to have shared them and to learn from one another. And I really hope, me and Juan were saying just before we started this, that 2 years ago, there was nothing on legal regulation at the CND, and now there is quite a few events in the next few weeks. So things are progressing, and things are moving quickly. And like we said at the start, the opening to mitigate further harm is now. So we do encourage you to really